This hearing will come to order. Madam Attorney General, we thank you for joining us today to discuss the President's recent executive actions. As chairman of this subcommittee, I believe that it is my duty to the American people to properly oversee the Department of Justice and ensure that any funding provided by this subcommittee is used as Congress intended and within the bounds of the Constitution. It's clear to me that the American people are fearful that President Obama is eager to strip them of their Second Amendment rights. Let me be clear. The Second Amendment is not a suggestion. It's an individual right protected in the Bill of Rights that has been recognized by the Supreme Court. And with that in mind, this morning I'm very concerned with the recent executive actions by the President for two main reasons. First, President Obama, I believe, is far too willing to end-run Congress through executive action. The President has said that he believes that when Congress doesn't act the way he wants us to, then he must act alone. Our Constitution won't allow for this kind of unilateral action, and the American people will not stand for it. Whether through executive amnesty to thousands of illegal immigrants or increased gun control measures, the President has unwisely, I believe, acted alone. However, what the President fails to remember is that we have a system of checks and balances. A system that was created to ensure that power was not concentrated in a single branch of the federal government. The President, I believe, has ignored the founder's system and accelerated the use of executive fiat in an alarming new level. Secondly, none of the executive actions that President Obama has proposed would have prevented the recent tragic events in our nation. Whether it's a terrorist attack or a single gun crime, I firmly believe that those responsible should be held accountable and that we must work to prevent it from happening again. As we've seen time and again, this President used tragic events to push his political agenda. I believe that he's more interested in grandstanding and engaging in anti-gun theatrics than actually doing the work necessary to protect this country. In the wake of the terrorist attacks in San Bernardino, President Obama did not address our law enforcement's failures, which allowed those terrorists to live among us. He also did not look at making changes to our immigration system after it clearly failed us by allowing an individual who should have been known to be a violent extremist to enter our country. Instead, the President's immediate response was to propose an additional gun control measures. Criminals and terrorists, let's be clear, criminals and terrorists are not buying their guns from gun shows, gun stores, or collectors because criminals, by definition, do not follow the law. Madam Attorney General, we live in a dangerous world, as you know, and the American people are looking for us to do everything in our power to keep them safe. The next time a terrorist attack occurs in this nation, innocent, law-abiding Americans must have the ability, I believe, to protect themselves and their loved ones from harm if they so choose. It is our responsibility, I believe, to preserve their rights and not limit them. I believe most of us know that this President has made no secret of his desire to restrict the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding American citizens. The American people deserve, and I believe they expect more from their President. They also expect more from their members of Congress, and I intend to live up to their expectation. Madam Attorney General, the Department is on notice. This subcommittee will have no part in undermining the Constitution and the rights that it protects. Senator Mikulski.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I congratulate you on holding a hearing so quickly in the opening session and taking up a topic of the issue of guns and their excessive availability in our society. This hearing does tackle the very pressing issue of guns and gun violence. When the average of 300 Americans are shot every day, 90 of them will die, almost a third. We do need to change our nation's culture of violence. We do need to stop guns getting into the wrong hands, the criminals, those with mental illness, without infringing on the right of law-abiding citizens to purchase firearms. But know that I do support the President's measure on guns. He is within his constitutional authority to act, and many of these activities, like adding more FBI and ATF agents, have strongly been supported by this committee. I think last year's omnibus, under your chairmanship, sir, really showed our commitment to enforcing the existing laws and the staff in order to do it. I do look forward to hearing the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch's testimony today on the President's recent announcement on guns and the impact it will have on the American people, and will it make us safe? No mincing, no message, no talking points. Will it really help the American people? Are we within our constitutional boundaries? We do respect the Constitution. And also, though, its impact on the Justice Department, on the ability to deal with this. We also will listen to the testimony of outside witnesses on the second panel. These are excellent people who are well-seasoned, well-experienced, and also a father who will talk about the grim things that happened at Sandy Point. Gun violence, no one's immune from gun violence. Whether you're a congresswoman trying to meet with your constituents named Gabby Gifford, whether your children going to elementary school in a wonderful suburban community called Sandy Hook, whether you're just simply going to movies or going to a community college, or sitting in a Charleston church of iconic nature in the civil rights struggle to study the Lord's word and welcome in the stranger to end in such a terrible tragedy. Our president was at that funeral, as he has been at so many, but what he says, we have to do something. So we look forward to this, and we look forward to what the president's proposals will be in the new year, the budgetary recommendations that he puts behind it. We are appropriators. We look forward to the president's recommendation. I'm particularly interested in strengthening the National Instant Criminal Background Check. There are backlogs. There are technological glitzes. People who want to go by the law are frustrated. We have to enhance the FBI's capacity to run background checks while we're asking them to do a lot of other background checks. And are there new ways to do this and to train local law enforcement? But this is not only a Justice Department problem. I just left the HELP hearing where we're holding a hearing on mental illness. And for so many of people who are victims of gun violence, the volatile combination of mental illness and access to guns are dangerous. Mr. Chairman, I look forward, though, not to me talking and listening to myself, but listening to the Attorney General and listening to this wonderful panel that you've invited to participate today. So let's solve the problem. Let's not get involved in constitutional arguments, and let's help our American people be safe and secure in their home, their neighborhood, their school, and their house of worship.
Madam Attorney General, welcome to the committee again. Your written testimony will be made part of the hearing record. You proceed as you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chairman Shelby, Vice Chairwoman Mikulski, and the distinguished members of this subcommittee. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the steps that the Department of Justice is taking to reduce gun violence and to ensure smart and effective enforcement of our nation's gun laws. Now, of course, as the subcommittee well knows, our nation faces an epidemic of gun violence that has taken a devastating toll on communities throughout the country. Each and every year, tens of thousands of Americans are injured or killed by firearms in armed robberies, domestic disputes, tragically suicides, accidents, shootouts, and heinous acts of mass violence. From law enforcement officers shot down while defending their communities to children killed in tragic accidents, our friends and family members, our neighbors, our fellow citizens are being taken from us day after day after day. As the list of tragedies involving firearms has grown, so has the American people's belief that we must do more to stem the tide of gun violence, and this administration is committed to doing our part. The executive actions that the President announced 2 weeks ago, including the measures that I recommended to him, are essential components of this effort. They are important steps that are within the executive's power to clarify existing legal provisions, to focus enforcement efforts, and to spur innovation. I have complete confidence that the common sense steps announced by the President are lawful. They are consistent with the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court and the laws passed by Congress. For example, the Gun Control Act lists the people who are not allowed to have firearms, such as felons, domestic abusers, and others. Congress has also required that background checks be conducted as part of sales made by federally licensed firearms dealers to make sure that guns stay out of the wrong hands. The actions announced by the President, which focus on background checks and keeping guns out of the wrong hands, are fully consistent with the laws passed by Congress. Taken together, the new executive actions will bring progress on a number of fronts. By clarifying what it means to be engaged in the business of dealing firearms, we raise awareness of and enhance compliance with laws that are already on the books. By issuing new regulations, we ensure that licensed dealers who ship weapons will report them if they are lost or stolen in transit, and that those trying to acquire some of the most dangerous weapons through trusts or corporations undergo background checks. By enhancing our national system of background checks, we will be better prepared to keep guns out of the wrong hands in the first place. By increasing access to mental health care treatment with a proposed $500 million investment to the Department of Health and Human Services, also referred to as HHS, we will not only be helping those in need, but we will also be curbing gun deaths, the majority of which tragically result from suicide. And by supporting research on gun safety technology, we will be laying the groundwork for a safer future and drawing on our strength as the most technologically advanced nation on earth. The steps that I have outlined and the actions that President Obama has described are all well-reasoned measures, well within existing legal authorities, and built on work that is already underway. They clarify laws that are already on the books, because clear notice will help ensure that those laws are followed. They direct important resources to our law enforcement agents, because these men and women deserve to have the support they need to do their difficult jobs effectively. And they lay the groundwork for state governments to more easily provide information to our background check system and for helping people with mental illness gain access to care. Because in addition to helping people get the treatment they need, we must make sure we keep guns out of the hands of those who are prohibited by law from having them. And they invest in research and promising technology that will make weapons safer. Because problem solving through innovation has always been one of our country's greatest strengths. Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairwoman Mikulski, I am confident that these actions will help to make our people safer, our communities more secure, and our law enforcement more effective. But I also have no illusions that these measures by themselves will end gun violence in America. At a time when there is so much work to be done and so much capacity for progress, there are many areas where only Congress can act. We would welcome the opportunity to work with you to further these goals. And that is why I am so grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you today about how we can work together to reduce gun violence in this country. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in the days ahead as we discuss how to keep our promise to protect and defend every American's right to safety and security and to life and liberty. At this time, I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Attorney General, as I said earlier, the Constitution's not a suggestion. You would agree with that, would you not? That the Constitution of the United States is not a suggestion.
Mr. Chairman, I agree that it is the law of the land and the law that we're all sworn to uphold.
The rights that it conveys to the people of this nation are not recommendations. You would agree with that, would you?
Mr. Chairman, I agree with you on that as well as your previous proposition.
And the Constitution obviously the Second Amendment is part of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, right?
It is an important part of the first set of amendments, that Bill of Rights.
And do you believe that the rights granted by the Second Amendment are equally as important as those granted by the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Seventh Amendment, and so forth? And would you say that it's all an integral part of the Constitution?
Senator, I believe the Bill of Rights and the subsequent amendments are indeed an integral part of the Constitution, as well as are the case laws that seek to interpret them.
Okay. Madam Attorney General, you said that you work closely with the President to craft these executive actions, to go as far as the President can legally go without overstepping. While we may disagree about whether or not the President has overstepped, and I'm sure we would, I'm concerned that the President is slowly but chipping away at our Second Amendment rights. Can you guarantee us, Madam Attorney General, that there is legal authority for the President to take the actions that he has taken, and can you provide the specific laws or court cases that support the position?
Well, Mr. Chairman, with respect to the recommendations that I made to the President, as indicated in my earlier remarks, I believe that they are consistent both with the Constitution and existing case law that interprets the Constitution, specifically the Heller case handed down by the Supreme Court that defined the Second Amendment and clarified the individual's right to bear arms, as well as the agency's right to promulgate guidance therefrom as well. With respect to the actions taken, I am confident that they are consistent with the laws of the land. They are within the President's authority because they seek to enforce the existing laws. They seek to strengthen the provisions that Congress has directed that we undertake to keep the American people safe, such as the NICS background system. They seek to enhance protections for those who have mental illness, providing greater treatment for them, another goal that I know this subcommittee supports.
Each time there's a mass shooting, the issue of expanded background checks re-enters the public debate. I think we must look at the facts, and the facts are that most of those actions are carried out by individuals that would not have been prevented by obtaining a firearm. The Sandy Hook crimes were committed by a young man who shot his mother and stole her guns. Now, Madam Attorney General, would a background check have prevented that horrible tragedy? The Virginia Tech shooter actually passed a background check to get his guns, much like those that committed similar crimes at Fort Hood, Aurora, Chattanooga, and the list would go on and on. More recently, the terrorists responsible for the attacks in San Bernardino obtained their guns through a straw purchase, which means a background check would not have helped them either. Yet we keep coming back to this issue. Madam Attorney General, could you walk through these examples and tell us how having more federal firearms licensees would have altered the outcome of those events?
Mr. Chairman, as I indicated, I do not believe that we're able to look back and find a specific measure that would prevent a specific crime, but that does not mean we must not seek to prevent future tragedies. With respect to strengthening our background system, sadly, the NICS system is overwhelmed at this point in time. And of course, as we saw with the tragic shooting in Charleston, that individual information was submitted, but because of a series of glitches through experienced and well-meaning examiners, the information needed was not discovered in time to prevent that. The licensed firearm dealers who submit this information deserve the best and most efficient NICS system that we can provide them. The individuals who submit their information and wait for that response also deserve the most efficient system that we can provide them. And certainly the measures that we are discussing today, for example, increasing the number of examiners for the NICS system, of course a matter directly related to our appropriations, seek to serve that important end. With respect to other tragedies, again, because as I look through the panoply of criminal laws, which give us a way to protect people and vindicate the rights of those who have been the victims of crime, yet have not yet found a way to erase the human condition that leads to crime. Of course, we are committed to doing everything we can, looking forward to making sure that our gun laws are effectively enforced and that our American people are kept as safe as possible.
Madam Attorney General, as we look back in some of these tragedies, and they're real tragedies, which of these individuals bought their gun from a gun show, and which of these criminals purchased their gun illegally online? I don't believe they did they?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not able to give you that information now, but what I can indicate is that with respect to the clarifications on who is required to seek a license as a federally licensed firearms dealer, that this is in response to inquiries that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives receives on a regular basis as they operate within gun shows to provide information and guidance. And they often receive telephonic inquiries as well from individuals seeking to comply with the law who want to know what are the standards, what are the things that determine whether or not they need to, in fact, apply for a license.
The area of new standards for gun dealers. A recent New York Times article states that the President's plan on gun control would require officials from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives to begin contacting gun sellers to let them know of new standards to clarify who would be considered a regulated dealer. The article goes on to suggest that the changes are particularly meant for online gun merchants who avoid conducting background checks in spite of making, quote, high-volume gun sales through certain websites. Madam Attorney General, the law requires that anyone selling guns for profits, which I believe would be high-volume gun sales, to have a federal firearms license. However, you're quoted in the article as saying, the article in the New York Times, right now, your words, it's really an internet loophole. Is this really a loophole in the law, or it's a failure of enforcement?
Well, Senator, I typically do not comment on news articles and would prefer to provide you my own response to that particular issue. With respect to internet sales, they are increasing. Not only do we see an increase in sales at the typical commercial level at which the average consumer may in fact appropriately buy a number of commodities, including firearms, we also see firearm sales growing on what is called the dark net. That is the particular part of the internet not accessible to the average consumer, but where illicit transactions are primarily held. These are not transactions where average law-abiding citizens are seeking to acquire a firearm lawfully and through the traditional process. These are internet sales where criminals are seeking to acquire firearms, but through which they can harm our American citizens. This is not a loophole per se, but it is an area of enforcement that the ATF has been focused on. As you indicated, with respect to the individuals who operate at gun shows, flea markets, and the like, there will be an educational component to the guidance. This information will be provided to them. They will be allowed to ask questions, and we believe that this will increase compliance and, frankly, lessen confusion among those individuals seeking to comply with the law. But where individuals operate on the dark net, primarily in illicit transactions, it will also put them on notice so that if enforcement actions need to be taken, there can be no discussion that they simply were not aware of this particular provision.
Madam Attorney General, I believe what we really should be talking about, not just here today, but across America, is how to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and violent offenders. This is an uphill battle, I believe, if the President continues to focus on eroding Second Amendment rights while commuting the sentences of criminals with firearm convictions. And while we can debate, and we will debate, the issue of mandatory minimum sentences, the President's actions to commute sentences of individuals convicted of illegally possessing a firearm is disturbing. I don't know, Madam Attorney General, I don't know these individuals and why the President feels that they need shorter sentences, but I do know this. This sends a message to criminals that if you commit a crime with a gun, this administration will not be hard on you, perhaps go easy on you. That's the wrong message. Aren't the President's actions, Madam Attorney General, sending a mixed message to Americans? One day he issues new executive actions to change gun regulations and then pardons criminals and gun-related convictions the next day. How can the President, and you, the Attorney General representing this administration, say he's committed to using every tool at the administration's disposal to reduce gun violence when his own administrator is not following through with the sentences of criminals with gun-related convictions? Does that trouble you?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't know the specific cases to which you refer.
We'll give you a
but
list
what I can tell you is that with respect to commutations or pardons, individuals who apply for those are carefully reviewed and carefully vetted, and only after consideration of a number of factors, in particular, again, there has been recent discussion about commutations of nonviolent drug offenders, and whether or not those individuals also have firearms convictions. I would need to know the specific case to which you are referring. But with respect to the President's Clemency Project, for example, it is a focus on looking at individuals who today would not necessarily have received the lengthy narcotic sentences they received, and who also otherwise qualify as nonviolent and with a particular type of record in incarceration. And certainly I'm happy to provide information to the extent that it's helpful on specific cases if you could alert me to them. I think that with respect to the issues that we are discussing today, however, again, providing clarification of existing case law, gathering the existing case law so that individuals seeking to comply with the law have in one spot an easy-to-read, comprehensive reference to what the existing law says qualifies as engaged in the business of dealing in firearms, so that they know whether they have to apply for a license or not, or so that their questions can be more informed, is in fact helping the American people in clarifying this important issue. Clarifying the issue of who needs to report a firearm when it's lost or stolen in transit allows ATF to begin investigations of stolen firearms much more quickly than we are able to now. Now we recover, Senator, on average of 1,300 guns a year from crime scenes that turn out to be either lost or stolen. And we don't know that information until they're recovered in the course of a criminal investigation. Learning that information earlier will help us to start the investigation earlier and hopefully find those shipments before they fall into the hands of criminals, which is, of course, the goal of all of us here.
Madam Attorney General, I won't go through the record here because this is the beginning, but I've been handed by staff here a number of people who were convicted of possession of firearms during committing a criminal act or using a firearm during a criminal act that have been let out of prison early and put us back on the people, which is dangerous. Thank you for your indulgence. Senator Mikulski.
Madam Attorney General, it's good to see you again. We welcome you back to this committee, and we from Maryland, we from Baltimore particularly thank the Justice Department for all of their help during our recent challenges in Baltimore related to the uprising we had over one young man's death, Freddie Gray, for which now it is going through the judicial system. And we're examining the need for additional criminal justice reform within our police department. But Madam Chair, over 350 Baltimoreans were killed last year. 350 dead, some of whom were little children who were killed as innocent bystanders, or there's a question of whether it was revenge killing. This was criminal work. The growing nexus of drugs, crime, guns, violence, murder. My question to you, when I look at the 350 deaths, what can we do in just plain English to keep the guns out of the hands of the criminals? I know we're talking about Second Amendment rights. Maryland is a state with enormous numbers of hunters, a gun tradition, particularly in our area. But you know, the gun tradition in Baltimore City shouldn't be that the drug dealer is the one who gets the guns. How can we, in either the president's new proposals or in current law, really have an aggressive effort on this issue of guns and criminals?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chairwoman. I think one of the most important things we can do is make sure that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is fully resourced. Our request for 200 additional agents and investigators for fiscal year 2017 is something that will, of course, be coming before this subcommittee with the 2017 budget. We do intend to, in our spend plan, send up information about the beginning of that process even this fiscal year. The law enforcement priorities of ATF at this point, consistent with the Smarter on Crime plan, are in fact to focus on the violent crime issue that you have just described, to focus on individuals who terrorize neighborhoods, who harm children, who essentially, through the unlawful possession of firearms, create a danger to law-abiding Americans seeking to live their lives in our vibrant cities. We are targeting not just the gun traffickers, but as my ATF director calls it, the trigger pullers, gang violence, places where we've seen an increase in violent crime. We are looking at ways to target our resources to focus on those individuals who are causing the most harm to our communities. So that is our first.
Do you feel that this is also due, this rising gun violence, not to interrupt, is related to the growing heroin epidemic? In other words, what's happened in my city, which is just awful, with these over 350 dead, not only the injured, God forbid, but the injured. But this is in every major city that this is going on. So it's just not like a Baltimore bubble. This seems to me like an epidemic that's hit our big urban areas.
Yes, ma'am, indeed. I believe that the phrase epidemic accurately captures the problem of the increase in heroin and opioid abuse that we are currently seeing. This is a problem in many of our urban areas, but I must say it has sadly spread across this country. There are many counties with various densities, even many rural areas, that are in the grip of an opioid and heroin epidemic. And with that often comes an increase in violence. There, our enforcement activities are focused on pairing ATF agents with DEA and FBI agents to target those criminal organizations that are bringing narcotics in and that are protecting the drug trade with their firearms.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Attorney General. My time is up. Senator Baldwin and I just left a hearing chaired by Senator Alexander and Vice Chair Senator Patty Murray on mental illness. Excellent panel, very excellent, superb witnesses. But I know that we're going to really talk about this issue of mental illness, people who are mentally ill getting drugs, this whole issue of privacy rights. What do you know? How do you stop? The Virginia Tech situation comes to mind, and we could go through other cases, but in Virginia Tech, that young man had been in and out of institutions. Who knew? Who could help? When do we intervene? So, and just their ability to get these guns. We also had a shooting at a Columbia Mall. We all have shootings. That's what's so terrible. We all have shootings. And so I look forward to hearing your comments also on the mental illness aspect. But I know we have excellent other senators here. I'm going to get to their questions. I'm going to hear their questions and your answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator Lankford.
Good morning to you. Thanks
for being
here, being a part of this. Let me bounce a couple questions off you that are timely as well. I served previously in the House of Representatives in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. It was part of the committee when we went through the subpoena process to ask your predecessor for additional documents for the Fast and Furious investigation on guns. Those were delayed to us. Privilege was announced on that. As of yesterday, a court has told the Attorney General's office, hey, those documents need to be turned over by February the 2nd. I need clarification. Will all those documents now be released to the Oversight and Government Reform Committee by February the 2nd, as per the judge's order?
Well, thank you for the question, Senator. We did receive that ruling yesterday. We are still reviewing that ruling. I am aware of that provision in it. We, of course, want to study it carefully and determine what appropriate steps to take and the timeliness of them. But I can certainly assure you that we will be either responding to the committee or to the court at the appropriate time.
So you're not saying yes or no whether those documents will be turned over in time? And clearly, they've been collected. They've been collected for years.
If we'll pursue any additional legal action, we have not made that decision. If we had, I would let you know. And since we have not, I'm not able to give you that information at this time.
Okay. Do you know when that answer will come back out?
We will let you know, certainly within the time period that you've just mentioned.
Okay. One of the conversations that I had with your predecessor was on process issues with ATF and FBI. FBI and ATF have two different sets of processes for many investigations. those can be combined to make sure that we have clear processes across DOJ on it. Do you know any kind of progress that's been made of late with ATF and trying to align with some of the FBI processes for how they do investigations in that process?
Well, Senator, I would need to know a bit more of the context of the processes you referred to, whether you're referring to either deconfliction or joint efforts. But if you could provide that, I'm happy to respond.
Be glad to. We'll try to follow up on that because that was an ongoing conversation that he and I agreed on, and that there was a process moving on that. Let me ask about some of the guidance, as you've mentioned several times, for the federal firearms licenses. The guidance that's come out seems to be the same as it was before, basically saying if you're in the business of dealing firearms, then yes, you have to be licensed. That's nothing new on it. What we're trying to get is what is the new definition? The previous definition for that seemed to change during the Clinton administration, actually, to have a lower number, to say people that are kitchen table dealers that are actually selling to their neighbors or occasionally sell a firearm out of their own collection. They're not a licensed dealer. What we're trying to get is a clarification, who is a licensed dealer? When will that clarification come out of what you're proposing, and will it be a regulatory change or a guidance document?
Well, Senator, the guidance document that has been promulgated does exactly that. It answers the question that you have raised. It collects information from all the cases that have considered this issue and provides, through a series of clear examples, a definition for when someone is engaged in the business and when they are not. And you are correct in the sense that the definition has not changed because the statute has not changed.
Right.
We are simply gathering the case law, the legal definitions that have been promulgated by courts in situations where people have been found to be engaged in the business, and also where they have clarified the definition of the hobbyist and the collector, because those exceptions also are still part of the law. Hobbyists and collectors are not required to obtain a license in order to transfer firearms. But it's important to note that this information has been scattered in a number of cases throughout the country. And as I mentioned before, ATF was constantly and still anticipates receiving inquiries from individuals seeking to comply with the law, asking if their activities constitute being engaged in the business of dealing.
So what will be the clear rule as far as how many firearms that you sell in a year time period? Is it over a lifetime? Is it number in your collection? Is it based on the amount of income that you receive? What will be the clear guidance for them?
The courts have determined that a number of factors are used in determining whether or not one is engaged in the business. And they've specifically said that there's not a specific number that makes one meet that test. Instead, it is the totality of circumstances. And essentially, if one is repetitively selling firearms, if you hold yourself out as a dealer, if in fact you do intend to make a profit, all of these things go into that calculation. The courts give them different weight, but because the statute, as you know, does not contain a numerical requirement.
Correct, and that's what we're trying to get at. See, there's a difference between a guidance and a regulation, as you know extremely well, and we're trying to find out if will be a rule promulgated in this or the guidance. I'll walk back through some of those details with you. I have one final question I find very important. The gathering of information that's going into the background checks. The interstate, what's called the Interstate Identification Index, is that information used for the criminal background check information as well? Excuse me, or only what's going into the National Criminal Background Check? What's the NICS search? Are both of them used, you know?
You know, I'd have to get clarification on that for you. This particular recommendation that we've made to the president focuses on strengthening the NICS system,
which is part of my concern on it as well, because this has been an issue. I don't find anyone here that says we shouldn't do background checks, and that database shouldn't be very effective. But if I can have just the pleasure of the chairman for a moment, let me just run through a couple of our states. In the states that actually submit information into the NICS system. Federally, if there's a federal conviction for a felony, that's going into the system right away. But if it's a state felony, as I look through the listing here, Alabama currently has 0 felonies. You'll be glad to know that, sir, running into the system. California has 4,032. You'll be glad to know that's all that's in California felonies. Delaware has 0. Maryland has 12. My fine state of Oklahoma has 1, a very law-abiding state, clearly. Rhode Island has 0, and Wisconsin has 106. That's not very many coming from our states into the NICS system. And so the question that I would have is, and I think there's been common agreement on, what's happening between the states that they're not submitting the information into the federal system, or is the federal system so complicated to get information into that our states of all stripes are not submitting that information?
Well, Senator, I think that you've raised a very important issue. As you know, after the Virginia Tech tragedy, the federal government did reach out to the states and request a greater influx of information into the NICS system. Federal agencies are required to report information into the NICS system. States do it on a voluntary basis. And in fact, in the years since the Virginia Tech shooting, the amount of information coming from all of our states has increased by approximately 70%.
Right, in mental health, but not in the felonies.
Well, it has increased by 70% across a number of categories, and I wouldn't be able to break that out for you. What I did do also quite recently, with the recommendations I provided to the President, I sent a letter to the governors of every state asking them to essentially look at their systems and processes and make sure that they were, in fact, setting up the most efficient systems to provide information to us. The Department of Justice also, through its grants programs, does provide support for states who need assistance in categorizing the types of offenses that need to be provided into NICS, and possibly also making their own systems consistent with NICS. And we will continue to do that. We look forward to working with our state partners on this. They are very important partners.
Right, and I would say, I know I've indulged the chairman's time, and I apologize for that and going a bit long on this question, but I would say this is an area of common ground where we could actually work together on this, and I look forward to that.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Shelby, and thank you, Vice Chair Mikulski, and thank you so much, Attorney General Lynch, for your leadership at the Department of Justice and for appearing before the Appropriations Committee again. I was encouraged in your testimony earlier that you want to focus on the smart and effective enforcement of our existing gun laws. And I think the budgetary proposals that you've laid out and the elements of the executive order that you've covered are strong and good attempts to do exactly that. I was pleased to hear you, as the nation's top law enforcement official, review what you believe to be the well-settled constitutionality of the actions proposed in the executive order and the actions proposed in the budget. So rather than debating that further, I'm going to move forward to what you view as the most valuable parts of the budget request, something where this committee will be taking action. A portion of the President's announcement was the addition of 200 new ATF and 230 new FBI personnel. As we've discussed, I have seen tragically firsthand in my hometown of Wilmington what a dramatic spike in gun violence can do to disrupt a town and a community, to wreak destruction and pain and loss on families and whole neighborhoods. And I am grateful for how the Department of Justice, through its Violence Reduction Network, has provided additional resources. But I've also seen how access to better quality background checks, access to better quality ballistic information, and an increased federal law enforcement presence can make a significant difference. Can you explain in a little more detail why these new ATF agents and new FBI personnel, these new examiners and investigators are really necessary, and how they can help reduce gun violence, not just in my hometown, but in rural areas and in urban areas all over this country?
Yes, thank you, Senator. With respect to our request, particularly for increased resources for ATF, we have discussed requesting resources that would allow us to hire 200 new agents and investigators. Some of those would, of course, work on the increased paperwork resulting from background checks, but the agents in particular will be focusing on the violent crime problems that we find to be so troubling in so many of our cities and towns and neighborhoods. They will be working in conjunction with task forces of state and local officers, because we found those to be extremely effective ways at focusing on the hot spots in particular areas. It would allow us also to increase the amount of enforcement that we provide over the internet sales, as I mentioned, but to really focus on the violent crime problems plaguing so many of our cities. In addition to the agents that we are requesting, the resources that we are requesting and would begin using this year would also go towards strengthening what's called the NIBIN network, the Ballistics Initiative. This is a law enforcement to law enforcement initiative that essentially traces guns found at crime scenes as well as casings, essentially all firearms-related evidence, and shares that information on a nationwide basis with law enforcement entities. It allows us to make connections. It allows us to find connections between firearms, between those who are using the firearms. We are, in fact, opening a national center for NIBIN analysis, which will be located in Huntsville, Alabama. It's due to open, I believe, in a few months. And this is a tool that our law enforcement agencies depend upon greatly. The ability to track firearms is of grave importance. In particular, as I mentioned, the ability to track stolen firearms is one that we feel can protect our communities. Stolen firearms, and even indeed those who are lost, those firearms that are lost, do not end up in the hands of law-abiding Americans. They end up in the hands of criminals, and they are recovered during criminal investigations. Sadly, they are recovered at the rate that we are seeing them, 1,300 a year on average over the last 5 years, once the crime has already been committed. One of the things that these regulations would do is allow us to begin those investigations earlier and hopefully intercept those shipments before they fall into the hands of criminals.
Let me, just in closing, thank you for the very good work that your team has been doing in partnership with the Wilmington Police Department. John Skinner, who's the lead, and the Office of Justice Programs, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, has done a great job. I've gotten to see firsthand how better access to NIBIN, better access to ballistics tools has improved our homicide case clearance rate in Wilmington from 10% 2 years ago to 50% this year. That makes a real difference. And having access to world-class and timely analysis and insight of ballistics evidence has significantly improved the investigatory and prosecutorial outcomes in my hometown. I am excited about this work. It is my hope that on a bipartisan basis, we can invest the resources to strengthen federal law enforcement to tackle gun violence around our country. As was said by Senator Mikulski in the opening, it is a crime, a shame that Americans literally in their going to church to worship, going to see movies, going to college classrooms, going to elementary school, have been victims of gun violence, and we must do more together to tackle this very real problem facing our nation. Thank you, Madam Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Senator.
Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Attorney General, for being here with us today, and thank you for your service to our country.
Good morning, Senator.
Very appreciative. I want to begin my statement by echoing what we've heard across the board, and that is the deep tragedy that we all feel when gun tragedies occur. It hurts us all, and certainly our prayers and thoughts are always with those most deeply affected. But I do think that acknowledging that there is a great deal of frustration by the unilateral actions that the administration has chosen to take to curb this gun violence. And part of the executive actions seem ambiguous and provide some confusion for law-abiding gun owners, and other parts seem a little bit more about political messaging. But that's not to say we should not take action, and we should first act, as we've spoken about and you have very eloquently, to enforce the laws that are already on the books. And I would like to focus on where our common ground is. As you know, much of the work that we've talked about today is actually conducted in West Virginia. The NICS and CGIS system is in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and the ATF tracing facility is in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Their efforts are invaluable to ensure that gun ownership is processed in an efficient and effective manner, and they each have proven their worth helping to track weapons and perpetrators of gun violence when crimes are committed. I've visited both of these facilities, and I've seen the professionalism and the deep commitment that they have to getting it right. You did mention they're overstressed and overloaded, and hopefully through the appropriations process that we worked through last year, we were able to increase the budget to make sure that we are able to employ more to make sure that they can successfully complete in a timely fashion the background checks. And so I wanted to get an understanding from you. The administration has called for an additional 230 NICS examiners. I understand in your statement, I'm sorry that I wasn't here, that you're going to go to a 24-hour system so that would that be 7 days, 24 hours? Is that your goal?
Yes, Senator, the goal is to increase the capacity of the current NICS system so that it could be responsive on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis. Currently, we are limited by staffing, and I believe that we are able to operate 17 hours a day. I actually am not sure if it's 7 days a week at this point in time. We also do have an electronic platform through NICS, so you may have seen that as well, the e-check system. That allows dealers to get information quickly, and we hope to, frankly, improve that platform greatly. We are working with U.S. Digital Services and gathering information into how to make that system more efficient so that that also can be up 24 hours a day. Right now, there are times when it must be down for maintenance, it must be down to get information uploaded into it. And so that will help us with the backlog that we are seeing, and that frankly we've seen over the last several months, and we anticipate will continue.
Have you begun the hiring on that, of the 230?
With respect to the 230, we do hope to begin hiring of that with using this fiscal year's appropriation, and then the 2017 request would allow us to maintain that. Because we need to move as quickly as possible, we will likely begin hiring on a contractor basis first. That's usually quicker than hiring full-time employees. But the goal is to have full-time employees on board. And as you know, for government employees, there is a significant, I shouldn't say significant, but there is time required for the background checks and the like. So it will likely be several months before we have that full component on board. And this is, of course, a matter of great concern for us because the NICS system at this point is at a point where it's becoming increasingly difficult to, in fact, process the applications within the 3-day time period.
Right. No, I certainly saw that when I was visiting. But let me ask you this. Senator Lankford, I think, brought up an excellent point. Your ability to trace and to perform an accurate background check is only as good as the information coming in. And as we saw in the Charleston, South Carolina incident, the information was unable, it was unable to be traced to that individual. How are we going to meet that challenge? And is that training at the local level? Is it the NICS examiner? What happened there?
Well, as I think you know, the NICS examiners are dedicated and pursue their jobs with great conviction and commitment. In the Charleston case, my understanding is that the arrest record was located in one particular jurisdiction, but the query was made of another jurisdiction.
Yeah, so how do we get around
side by side? And because there wasn't a conviction yet, it prevented it from being in the court system. And so the examiner followed all the queries.
Right.
As per normal.
As they could.
And the information was literally sitting in an adjoining county's sort of bucket, so to speak, and so was not pulled in that. And it was frankly heartbreaking to all of us who work on this matter, from the FBI throughout the Department of Justice. And one of the reasons why even then we began looking at ways to improve the NICS system. You know, the FBI director commissioned a report, and we have folded a number of those recommendations into this request. Being able to modernize the electronic database will be greatly helpful in making sure that all of the relevant jurisdictions are in fact able to be queried. If that could happen on an electronic basis, it would certainly ease the situation. Of course, looking back, it's impossible to say what electronic system could have prevented this glitch, but certainly going forward, that's one of the things we're looking to do in strengthening the electronic platform for the NICS system. Also, in terms of the examiners, making sure that they have the time to conduct these examinations and to provide a response to the dealers who call in. Most of this is still done over the phone. Most of the responses are still handled very, very quickly. Often the dealer will get an answer in that first phone call, but the difficult cases, the ones where you really do have to look and search and make sure that this individual is not prohibited, those often do take time. Now still, it's a system of which we are incredibly proud. Over 2 million people have been prohibited from purchasing firearms as a result of NICS background checks, and we think that that is frankly a benefit to the country and to public safety. So we are incredibly proud of the system, but we really do want to make it the best system that we can.
Well, and I want to pledge to work with you to make sure that the fine folks in West Virginia who are doing these, the NICS system and the background check, have the best technology, have enough staff to help them. It's a very stressful position in a lot of ways for many of them, and I hope that we can get, with this additional hiring, we will eliminate some of these loopholes that people are able to fall into and prevent those who shouldn't from getting a firearm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Madam Attorney General, you certainly look well, and as if you're not worn out by the job. I want you to say, I haven't seen you since your confirmation, so it's very good to see you again.
Thank you.
I'm glad you stressed that the President's executive order largely clarifies existing law, which clarification should make enforcement easier, and which enforcement is what people seem to want of existing law. However, you do have to have people to enforce existing law. As you have said twice in your remarks and once in your written remarks, ATF is requesting $35.6 million for an additional 200 special agents and industry operation investigations through ATF. But my understanding is that ATF is going to have the retirement of 544 special agents this year. They're eligible to retire. I can't say how many are going to retire, but it certainly appears to me that with ATF being an enforcement agency, that you're going to lose people and that that's going to have an unfortunate effect. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes, Senator, and thank you for raising that important issue. ATF, like so many agencies, is facing a situation where so many of the talented agents are soon able to retire. We certainly hope that they will not, but we know that we will lose some. I think it's also important to note that the request that would bring an additional 200 agents and investigators on board still would not increase the size of the agency. It's not a request for additional FTE, so to speak, but the budget to hire to fill the existing slots that are vacant now and will soon be vacant.
Well, let me say this. I speak for a state that's now over 40 million people. By census, 39.1, and probably another 2 million that avoid the census. We want the enforcement of existing law. We want to see that ATF is staffed and able to do it. And this is the subcommittee that's responsible to see that ATF is funded sufficiently to enforce everyday laws. So I'm going to do everything I can on this committee to see that that amount is raised so that you get the sufficient number. So I would appreciate all of the data that you can provide me with. Thank you. The second thing are machine guns and other fully automatic weapons, as well as weapons like short-barreled shotguns. These are all regulated under the National Firearms Act. And it's been reported that individuals have been able to avoid regulation under the Firearms Act by applying to acquire these dangerous guns through trusts or corporations rather than, excuse me, as individuals. The number of applications for such transfers has increased from fewer than 900 applications in 2000 to more than 90,000 applications in 2014. Now, those the trusts are obviously being used not to have to register them, or not to have to have a background check, or not to have to buy them through a licensed firearm dealer. So how has ATF managed to keep up with this massive increase in NFA applications despite flat manpower levels?
Well, Senator, the reality is that it is difficult to keep up with those applications. For National Firearms Act weapons, as you've indicated, the silencers, short-barrel shotguns, and machine guns, there's an application process similar to a background check, but an application process. And it also typically at this point in time requires what's called a law enforcement officer certification. A local law enforcement officer has to also certify the person can do that. One of the regulations promulgated after going through the notice and comment period is a regulation that requires individuals who are seeking to purchase these weapons under the National Firearms Act to undergo a background check, whether they're using a trust or any other legal entity or whether they are a standalone person. Right now, if an individual seeks to purchase the silencer, a short barrel weapon, they have to undergo an application process similar to a background check. When they use a trust, they do not. The current regulation that has gone through notice and comment, that is being promulgated as a final rule, essentially closes that loophole and says that individuals using a trust or a legal entity stand in the same position as individuals standing alone. But what it also does is it removes the law enforcement officer certification requirement, because that essentially has been obviated by the background check, and that was an additional delay on the license. So with the information that we are getting from the background checks, individuals, whether they are using a trust, a legal entity, or whether they are applying as individuals, will have the same requirements and undergo the same level of scrutiny before buying a National Firearms Act weapon. And that is one of the rules that was promulgated within this past week as well.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted that you're on top of this. Of the 25 attacks of more than 4 people killed in the last 10 years, California has 6 of them. So I think watching machine guns and those things that can be used to attack others is really important. And I thank you very much, and I'll do everything I can to be of help in seeing that you get more ATF agents. Thank you,
Senator.
Senator Boozman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for being here today.
Good morning, Senator.
I have a number of concerns with the way the President continually overreaches his authority. And something that really concerns me is the executive actions in this upcoming rule, proposal by the Social Security Administration to include folks who have fiduciaries into the NICS program. This is certainly not clarifying existing law. This would prohibit them from the constitutional Second Amendment right, not based on due process, but only on the fact that they requested a family member or friend to assist them with their finances. I'm concerned with your department's final ruling that revised some of the definitions regarding being adjudicated as a mental defective and committed to a mental institution to now more broadly cover folks who seek treatment. I'm concerned because these were not changed through Congress, and now you couple it with the upcoming Social Security rule. What are we going to have? Please tell me what your department's plans are here. What is the Social Security Administration planning to do, and who will be entered into the NICS based solely on Social Security records?
Senator, thank you for raising that important issue. As you know, the current Gun Control Act does prohibit individuals who have been adjudicated in certain ways involving their mental health from possessing firearms. And currently, under current law, federal agencies are required to submit information to NICS about individuals who fall into those categories: involuntary commitment and adjudications of the type that you were discussing. The Social Security Administration is beginning a process of seeking comment through a rulemaking process in order to clarify who within the Social Security Administration adjudication system should also fall into that category as well. For example, I'll withdraw that, it's not an example, but they currently are not providing the information. And so the questions that you raise are very real and salient ones, and the Social Security Administration's process, which is just beginning, is designed to, in fact, solicit comment, get input as to which types of adjudications should, in fact, be provided to NICS and which should not. Because as we know, the issue of mental illness is not one that subjects every individual who has that issue to a prohibition from obtaining a firearm. And so it's important that we clarify, as other agencies have, which types of adjudications and which types of issues would require those records to come to NICS. So the Social Security Administration is beginning that process, and certainly we look forward to providing whatever input and guidance they request from the Department of Justice on that as well. One of the things that will, of course, be part of that is, as with all of that, for example, our VA already provides records, but one of the things that will be part of that process is making sure that any individual who may find themselves in that situation receives notice that that is a possibility. That is something that would be consistent with existing law and the Second Amendment, and also that there is a way for an individual to apply to have their rights restored, not just to own and possess a firearm, but anything else that might be a collateral consequence of a particular type of adjudication. At this point, I can't predict for you what types of adjudications the Social Security Administration would decide should be provided to the NICS system, but we certainly look forward to them going through the comment process and refining that area.
Good. Well, thank you, because that really is a real concern. I've heard from a number of police departments in Arkansas who've had equitable sharing funds recently removed from their accounts due to the Department of Justice's mismanagement of the budget. In a letter from your department dated December 21st, 2015, regarding the asset forfeiture program, it states that DOJ has already begun implementing cost reduction measures. What are the measures, and when do you envision the equitable sharing program to be reinstated? Can you explain the benefits of this program to the American people? I say this because it is an important program, and we're so concerned about violent crime. This is one of the tools that we're using very effectively in order to decrease that and fight that battle.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, Senator, because I share your concern and also our regard for the strong working relationship that the federal government has with our state and local counterparts. Certainly, as a U.S. attorney, I was a direct beneficiary of their talent and their expertise, and now as Attorney General, I do all I can to keep those relationships strong and vital, because they are essential to protecting the American people. With respect to the equitable sharing issue that you've raised, there have been some budget issues there. There was a rescission from the department's asset forfeiture fund made in the last fiscal year. I don't know the exact time of it, and that essentially limited our ability to provide funds pursuant to equitable sharing. We are looking forward to restoring those payments as soon as the receipts to the asset forfeiture fund allow. We very much feel that equitable sharing is an important law enforcement tool. I know that there is a great deal of discussion about asset forfeiture in general. We have been working with Congress to make sure that we retain this important aspect of it while also addressing those concerns as well.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chair Mikulski, for holding this important and timely hearing. Violence continues to plague our communities. In my home state of Wisconsin, gun homicides reached their highest point in a decade last year in the city of Milwaukee. And while we finally saw a notorious gun dealer, once called the #1 seller of crime guns in America, start to clean up its act and be held liable for selling firearms used to injure cops, other gun dealers have rushed in to take its place. I hope that all of my colleagues can agree that we can and must do more to address this critical issue and more to keep our communities safe. Now, I'm a gun owner, and I support and respect the Second Amendment. But at the same time, I'm very frustrated that the Senate has been unable to advance common sense and bipartisan measures to bolster both the enforcement of our existing gun laws, but also to pass additional safety provisions. And in the absence of leadership on this important issue by the Congress of the United States, I have to say I applaud the President for taking small steps to strengthen the enforcement of existing federal gun laws. In our limited time, I want to call your attention to two Wisconsin matters. One that I noted in my preface, which is that Milwaukee was home for years to a notorious rogue gun shop, Badger Guns, which in 1 2-year period alone was the source of weapons used to shoot and wound 6 Milwaukee police officers. In 2005, it was the top seller of crime guns in the entire country, according to sources that I've seen. But the shop, which first opened in 1987, had been found in violation of federal firearms laws by the ATF as early as 1989. And subsequent inspections uncovered additional violations. A 2006 recommendation by federal investigators that its license be repealed went unheeded. And it was not until 2011 that the shop lost its ability to sell guns. Now, despite an active role by the ATF in monitoring this facility, this store, it was allowed to put guns into the hands of dangerous criminals again and again and again. So you made it clear in your testimony that the president's actions are not wholesale solutions. We understand that. But I'd like to hear from you how the steps that we're discussing today, including support for more ATF personnel, might have helped stop a bad actor like Badger Guns, and what more the Congress can do to prevent stores like this from contributing to gun violence.
Well, thank you, Senator. Certainly, separate and apart from the recommendations I made to the President, as the subcommittee is aware, it is already a crime to knowingly sell a gun to someone who is prohibited. And what I will say is that ATF is dedicated to enforcing that law as well. And so where there are gun dealers, and it is a very small percentage of them that are in the category that you discussed, ATF does take enforcement actions there. Often the guns, through NIBIN or through other means we discover, come from the shops. As you mentioned, we learn from investigations that of shootings of law enforcement officers, of civilians, where the guns tend to come from, and that supports us. It's impossible to look back, unfortunately, and sort of recreate an investigative trail and say what could or should have been done in that instance, as I'm not familiar enough with that situation. But what I can say is that as part of the enforcement of the existing laws, ATF takes situations such as you mentioned very, very seriously. It is indeed not the majority of the licensed firearms dealers in America. It's a very small minority of them. But where we find a situation where a gun shop, such as you mentioned, has that type of record, it is something that would be subject to enforcement actions.
Well, I thank you. Obviously, in continuous operation from 1987 to 2011 draws some extremely significant concerns. And so, obviously we want to see more swift action in cases like this moving forward. I've run out of time, but hope to submit for the record an additional question regarding an ATF operation in Milwaukee that raised significant concerns in the last couple of years.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Attorney General, for your leadership and for your testimony this morning. One of the benefits of coming in late is getting to listen to the probing questions of my colleagues, and one of them was Senator Feinstein's question about the trust in corporations that over the last 15 years apparently have been more active in acquiring weapons. And just a few questions. One is that the proposal by the President would sort of pierce the corporate veil and require the individuals who are actually obtaining these weapons to run a background check. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir. Yes, Senator.
And are these generally, these corporation trusts set up to avoid limitations on owning automatic weapons, machine guns, or do they are applying increasingly with just handguns and what we would consider to be personalized weapons?
Well, typically we see trusts and other corporate entities being used to purchase the weapons that are not handguns, that typically one can go to a dealer and purchase fairly quickly and easily, but weapons that are on the under the National Firearms Act. They usually are the short-barreled shotguns, certain types of machine guns, as well as silencers.
Right. Now, it just strikes me somewhat ironically because the Second Amendment is seen, and I think appropriately so, as a individual right that Americans have, and to create corporations and trusts to be, and it's not alone in this area, having been a lawyer myself for a little bit, corporations and trusts are often created to evade, evolve, or illegally do something that directly can't be done. So I think this is a very sensible step and reflects the thoughtful way that you and the President have proposed these very sensible improvements on background checks. Another issue that was raised by my colleague from Oklahoma, and it was a very good one too, is the issue of engaged in the business. And from your answer, You rejected a categorical, the arbitrary number of weapons, and you reflected the opinions of the courts interpreting the Constitution. Is that I assume that's the rationale, to ensure that this is constitutionally consistent with the court decisions?
Yes, Senator. We essentially have crafted the guidance to reflect what the courts have said defines who is engaged in the business of dealing firearms. And the courts have said that there is no set number. Certainly there can be large numbers of firearms transferred, but if someone in fact has a collection and is simply selling that, that would not make them subject to the licensure requirement. But if someone may be selling only a few guns, but if they sell them repetitively, if they hold themselves out as a dealer, that's a very, very different scenario. Essentially, it's not limited to where one operates, but to what one does that determines whether one is a dealer or not. And so we've collected the guidance based on court cases around the country into a document that we hope will be clear and easily understandable for people who have those questions.
So this is not, as I say, an arbitrary decision. It is a reflection of the court's view on the Second Amendment rights of the individual Americans.
Yes, Senator.
One other general issue, too, is that the effect of these regulations overall, clearly in a very gross sense, two populations: people who are exercising their rights for self-defense, for recreation, for hobbyists, etc., and people who are trying to obtain a weapon for illicit purposes. The effect of the President's regulations on both groups, my hope is that no impediments for those who honestly seek legitimate use of firearms and the right to do so, and reasonable constraints on those people who have illicit motives. Is that your...
That is correct, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam Attorney General.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Attorney General, for being here with us today. I wanted to, before I get into a question or two about the guidance, just continue on this line of questioning about resources. I think we've talked a lot about ATF resources, but I wanted to explore a little bit more deeply about resources within the NICS system itself. And as we start to game out our budget for the 2016-2017 appropriations year, what should we be looking at in terms of the appropriations necessary for the Department of Justice to be able to do all of the things that we contemplate NICS has to do in order to keep up with the increasing number of applications, but also the increased coordination that we want to see to make sure that we have all of the records uploaded onto that system?
Yes, Senator, thank you for that that question. I think it's a very timely one as we look to invest in a system that is, in fact, one of our first lines of defense against keeping guns out of the hands of those who should not have them. Essentially, for fiscal year 2015, NICS performed over 23 million background checks. That number is increasing. In just this December alone, they received over 3 million requests. That's the highest number of requests on a monthly basis since the month after the Sandy Hook shooting. For FY 2016, our estimates are that we would need $121 million to run NICS. We're asking for an additional $35 million for the fiscal year 2017 on top of that base figure. That would allow us to maintain the additional positions we hope to add this year. We may not be able to add all of them right away. As I indicated, there is time required to bring federal employees on board. It would also help us improve the electronic platform of NICS. Our goal is to have the NICS system operational on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis by the end of this year. That will require a great deal of information technology investment and support, but that is our goal.
And for those whose focus is simply on enforcing existing law, that request is based upon your belief that you need that level of appropriations in order to enforce the law that's on the books today.
That is correct, Senator. In order to provide for the accurate and efficient operation of the NICS system within the 3-day period that has been set forth by Congress, in order to allow us to process the applications in a timely fashion and provide the information that dealers request, that is the basis for this request.
Mr. Chairman, I hope that we could enter into the record. I don't think it's been done yet, but I would like to enter into the record the actual guidance that is the subject of this hearing, if there's no objection. Wanted to enter in the guidance into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would hope that those that have an opinion, especially those that have a strong opinion on this guidance, would actually take the time to read it. Because our second panel is going to include individuals who are going to call it an unwarranted assault on the Second Amendment, an effort to intentionally intimidate and harass law-abiding citizens. There will be those that call it patently unconstitutional. I hope people will read through what this guidance actually says. In summary, it's 5 points. One, that the federal law requires that persons who are engaged in the business of dealing firearms be licensed by the ATF. That's a simple recitation of existing law. Second, that you can be engaged in the business of dealing firearms regardless of the location in which the firearm transaction is conducted. I'm not sure that anyone would dispute that fact. Third, that determining whether you're engaged in the business requires you to look at specific facts and circumstances of your activities. Again, that seems patently clear. Fourth, that as a general rule, you need a license if you repetitively buy and sell firearms with the principal motive of making a profit. But if you only make occasional sales of firearms, you don't need to be licensed. Clear restatement of existing law. And then fifth, a simple explanation about what existing courts have already said to interpret the law. And so to the extent that a lot of the objections may be over this fifth key point, let me just ask you to state clearly for the record, this fifth point on your page of key points, that is simply a recitation of existing court interpretations of the underlying law. There's nothing in there that is a new statement of law that simply summarizes what existing courts have found relative to who is required to have a license.
That is correct, Senator.
And currently, there is a difference of opinion. There have been different interpretations by different courts as to the interpretation of that law.
Yes, Senator, that's also correct.
And so for those who are trying to determine whether they fall under the law or not, the existing court precedent may be confusing or sometimes hard to track down.
Yes, it is. It is often hard to track down. And also, it's a lot to ask the average citizen to do a LexisNexis search and do legal research and determine, what the courts have said about how they are operating. And in fact, what often happens is that individuals who are operating either at gun shows or smaller sales or even out of other locations will reach out to ATF and they have questions. They say, this is what I'm doing, and I don't know if it means whether I need to apply for a license or not. They ask those questions in person. When they see the investigators at gun shows, they call in with those questions. And so our hope is that this guidance, along with the educational program that ATF will be beginning, which is providing the information to people, will allow individuals to have some clarity about this issue. We don't assume that everyone is a lawyer or even wants to be, but they do have this requirement if they are engaged in the business of dealing in firearms. And it's our hope that this will ease compliance